Karim, do you think there is, first of all, that internal political debate is happening? And if it is has that led to a rift within the elite political group?
You know,
and what are the signs of that?
The dynamics have changed, because before, Iran was a political system which was very factionalized. It was more expansive. You still had people like Khatami, Rafsanjani, etc. in the system. And they were debating from within. Now, since June, and this process began when Ahmadinejad first was elected in 2005, gradually any moderates or pragmatists who were part of the system have been gradually purged from the system. So I joke that the color spectrum of the Iranian regime now ranges from pitch black to dark gray. It's not a very wide spectrum. And I think this is dangerous for the Islamic Republic, because they've pushed these people out who were previously part of the system. And what I find interesting, the metaphor I think about in my head for someone like Rafsanjani is a good example, who was kind of pushed out of the power structure, or even Mousavi or Khatami. These guys don't want to see as fundamental a change as, say, those of us in this room want to see in Iran. I think they could live with, or they even aspire to see, an Islamic Republic light. They still have a stake in the current system. So I kind of think about this metaphor of picture a long dining table filled with plates of food, and they're trying to pull the tablecloth from underneath, but keep those plates of food still on the table. They don't want the entire system to collapse, because they would stand to lose a lot. And I think that Ahmadinejad has really, when we look back on history, I think that he really has been profoundly irresponsible. If I'm Ayatollah Khamenei, I'm furious with Ahmadinejad, because this should be a time when Iran is flourishing. I mean, oil prices reached $150 a barrel under his watch. And despite that, Iran was the only major oil producer in the world whose population claimed that their economic lot had gotten worse, despite the quadrupling of oil prices. I mean, it's quite an achievement when you think about it. Oil prices quadrupled, and people say we're worse off than we were. And given some of the foreign policy, I think, blunders of the United States, we had really given Iran tremendous cards to play with. And despite that, the regime is in its greatest crisis of the, since its inception. So my own take on it is that, there's a joke that Iranians, the biggest political party in Iran is the Hezb Bad, the party of the wind. People shift with the political winds. But my friend Afshin Molavi says it's actually the Hezb Shikam, the party of the stomach. And when people say that, okay, we voted for this guy in 2005, not so he could deny the Holocaust or be belligerent toward Israel, so he could, quote unquote, put the oil money on our dinner tables, and he's failed magnificently in doing that, I think that his political future is now very bright. And Christian is right, he has a base. There's still folks in the traditional classes who I think give him the benefit of the doubt or like him. But my own take is that the events of the last 6 months have narrowed that base, have made that base smaller. And it's always a fool's errand to make predictions about Iran, but if you just simply look at Iran in a demographic context, 2/3 of the country under 32, 50% under 25, vast majority of people born after the 1979 revolution. 2009 is a much different world than 1979. They have access to satellite television, to the internet. They see how their counterparts elsewhere in the world are living. They go to Dubai, they go to Turkey. I'm confident saying, having been based in Iran several years, that certainly among the young population, a vast majority of people would like to see sweeping reform. I'm not talking necessarily about a secular Jeffersonian democracy, but I think they would like to see sweeping economic, political, and social reform.
So this actually brings us to the next question, which I'm still going to stay with you, because I want you to talk to us about who the reformers are. What is it that they want? If it's a sweeping change across the border, economic, social, financial, political, is it a modified theocracy? Do we stay within the frames of a theocratic government? or is it a liberal democracy, Karim? And do they have a sense that they're in for a long struggle? Are they ready to stay on the streets and keep the demonstrations?
You know, I think part of the dilemma that the opposition faces is that there is an age and a worldview gap between the leadership of the Jombish Sabs, the Green Movement, and the young foot soldiers, these university students in the street. I think if Mousavi were sitting here and you would ask him, what's your end game, what's your ideal system, I think he would like to see basically a more accountable, reformed Islamic Republic. I think he still believes in that idea. Khatami, whom I've actually spent time with in Davos and elsewhere, I've seen him, I think publicly he doesn't have the bravery to say this, but in private he will say the concept of Islamic democracy has been proven that it can't work. We need actually a secular system. But as I said, I think that many of the leadership of the reform movement feel like they have a stake in the status quo. But the younger people on the streets, I think, would like to see much more profound change. And there's really a symbiotic relationship between these two, between the leadership and the young foot soldiers. And they both kind of realize that they need one another. The young people in the universities know that they actually need someone like Rafsanjani to be on their side. They need to see these splits between the clergy, between the security guard, between the revolutionary guards, that those splits are positive for them. So they don't want to go too far to kind of alienate the leadership. And at the same time, the leadership needs to show that they can muster, you know, hundreds of thousands of people on the street, even though I think some of the chants that the slogans they've heard from the youngsters, like Jomhuriye Irani, Iranian Republic instead of Islamic Republic, may be slightly unsettling for some of them. It's this symbiotic relationship. And I think what the regime wants to do is create rifts between the leadership of the opposition and the young people. They use, for example, Khomeini's legacy as a means to try to create...
And have they succeeded in that?
I don't think they have. And I think that this is, I think, the greatness of Ahmadinejad in a way, that he is incredibly adept at uniting people against him. This common contempt for Ahmadinejad, I think, has really united people in a way that was unthinkable maybe a year ago.
Thank you, Karim. Jamie, Alan Kupperman, he's the director of the National Nuclear Proliferation Program, recently wrote an op-ed in New York Times where he has argued, persuasively actually, that the idea of a nuclear deal with Iran, whose deadline has come and passed, was ill-conceived to begin with, that the world has to actually breathe a sigh of relief that Iran even rejected it. And the only plausible option for the United States is to bomb the nuclear sites of Iran, the known nuclear sites of Iran. Given Iran's history of support for terrorist groups, militia groups, proxy wars, distant theaters of operation, how likely is it for an American president to order an attack on Iran?
Boy, that's a tough one. Let me start by...
And she said persuasively.
Yeah, let me start with that. I didn't think he was very persuasive.
You didn't like him.
I thought that he's an amateur who has made a career of being counterintuitive. And he's really the first, let's call, other than the extreme neoconservatives, to say that this proposed swap of material, nuclear material, was a bad agreement. The neoconservatives obviously didn't like it, but for a moderate or left of center analyst, he was the first one to say that. And he used some arguments that are highly controversial, and I'm not a technocrat, so I'm not going to begin to try to discern for you how easy it is to turn nuclear material for a medical reactor into material for a nuclear bomb. But let me just say that I happen to know the guys that are working this in the US government, and they're very hard-nosed guys. They're people who worked at laboratories where nuclear weapons were made, particularly Gary Seymour, came from the U.S. nuclear weapons laboratories, and I have a lot of confidence in them. And I think they were very clear that their idea was in many ways a ploy, but it was an important ploy because it was a delaying device, and that all they really were trying to achieve through this agreement that for about a week or two seemed possible was to just push down the road a year, 2 years, the time in which Iran could, if it chose, take all the stuff under its control and make a nuclear weapon. So I think Mr. Kupperman was wrong about criticizing the deal. But that doesn't really matter to his argument because it looks like the deal isn't going to happen. It may happen, but it doesn't look like it's going to happen. So the question that is left is, if you can't get an agreement with Iran,
what do you do?
What do you do? And his argument was that the only plausible decision is to use, and here again he was wildly out of his lane of expertise in talking about limited airstrikes on particular facilities. I think those of us who have talked to actual military officers who've been charged with, putting plans together understand that it is not a simple matter to lay down, 20 or 30 air attacks on Iran's program and solve the problem and then be in a position to prevent Iran from retaliating. One of the reasons, again, why this article was so silly was that he just dismissed the possibility of Iran retaliating. You just laid out some of the reasons why Iran is a dangerous country for its behavior of particular regimes or elements of the regime around the world, to suggest that after the United States has attacked Iran with military force, that they're not going to do any number of the dangerous and painful things they could do, whether it's to the Persian Gulf oil supplies or responding to American forces in Afghanistan and Iraq, whether it's launching pure terrorist attacks around the world the way they did in Argentina. There's any number of responses. And so this question of military force is a tough one, because you have to weigh, what do you get out of it? And will you be able to genuinely stop the program, or will you be able to delay it long enough for these painful consequences to be worth it? I'm someone who watched and didn't believe the Bush administration thought through the consequences of the Iraq War. I was sympathetic to the idea of the war, but there are costs. And there will be costs if the United States attacks Iran.
Right.
How big? One can begin to have a discussion, but there will be costs. You need to weigh those costs very realistically against the gains, and that's where it's a much closer call than Mr. Kupperman's rather facile op-ed discussed. But in the end, it's a question that really will boil down to, I think interestingly, he dismissed the more likely outcome that two individuals in Israel, Ehud Barak and Benjamin Netanyahu, are going to have a conversation one of these days about whether they're going to follow through on their bluff, because they've been bluffing quite loudly. Barak himself was involved in the planning of the Syria attack, and it's my understanding was quite pleased with himself for conducting a raid that appears to have accomplished its mission with minimal damage to the West. And so it may be that the confidence in the Israeli military that has been lost from time to time may be brought back, and in that case it is plausible that he and Mr. Netanyahu might consider acting, because I think the other course of action, and we were talking about this before everyone came in, the sanctions route, I would call it a necessary but not very satisfying policy.